Welcome back to another story. And if this is your first time here, I want you to know that you chose the perfect moment to arrive. Because what I am about to share with you today is unlike anything we have told before on this channel. This is a story about patience so profound it becomes its own kind of magic. It is a story about a woman who gave her most honest self to something that could not answer her, and about what happens when the universe finally decides that kind of devotion deserves a response. So, settle in, make yourself comfortable, and if you already know that this is going to be something special, go ahead and leave a like right now, because this story earned it before it even began. The village of Ashenvail sat in the belly of a mountain range so old that the peaks had no proper names anymore. Only descriptions passed down through generations in hushed tones. The teeth of the sky, the frozen shoulders, the place where the wind remembers. It was a settlement of roughly 400 souls, divided as all settlements in the Eternal Peaks territory were divided into the 3 designations that had structured werewolf society for as long as written history could reach. Alphas at the top, commanding and certain, their authority woven into the social fabric like load-bearing threads that no one dared pull. Betas in the middle, the administrators and craftspeople and mediators, respected but never quite trusted with true power. And Omegas at the bottom, defined by their gentleness and their capacity for deep emotional connection, and their secondary status in a world that had decided long ago that softness was not the same thing as strength. Mara Ashvale was an Omega, and she had known it since the morning of her 8th birthday, when her designation manifested in the way all designations did, with a shift in scent and a subtle change in the eyes, and an awareness in the chest that felt less like a transformation and more like an arrival, like something that had always been true about her, had simply decided to become visible. Her mother had held her close that morning and said nothing for a long time, and Mara had understood even then that the silence was a kind of preparation, a gentle arming for the world she was about to navigate more consciously. The world was not cruel to her in any dramatic or cinematic way. It was cruel in the way that most real cruelty operates, quietly and systematically, and with the complete cooperation of everyone who benefited from the system, including sometimes its own victims. Omegas in Ashenvail did not attend the same council meetings as Alphas. Omegas did not hold property independently until they were past their pairing prime, which the law defined as 35. An age at which the village collectively decided an unpaired Omega was no longer worth controlling. Omegas had their choices reviewed and in many cases overridden by the Alpha families who governed each district, and the review process had no appeal mechanism, because who would an Omega appeal to? Another Alpha? The structure ate its own objections before they could be properly formed. Mara learned all of this not through dramatic confrontation, but through accumulation. A door that was always just slightly harder for her to open. An opinion that was heard, but never quite recorded. A dream discussed with an advisor who smiled kindly, and then explained, gently and with apparent genuine concern for her well-being, why that particular dream was perhaps better suited to someone of a different designation. She was not broken by these things. She was sharpened by them, the way certain materials become stronger under sustained pressure. Not because pressure is good for them, but because they were always built to survive it. What saved her, she would say later, much later, was the wolf on the mountain. She had first seen it when she was 7, the winter before her designation manifested, when her father had taken her on the annual pilgrimage that every family in Ashenvail made to the high ridge on the first day of true snowfall. It was tradition, old enough that no one remembered its origin anymore. Just that you went up to the ridge, and you stood before the great stone wolf, and you paid your respects, and you came back down, and the winter treated you fairly in return. Most people did exactly that. They made the walk. They stood in front of the massive carved figure for an appropriate amount of time. They said something, brief and formal, and they left. The wolf was impressive, certainly. It was enormous, nearly 3 meters at the shoulder, even frozen in its seated position, carved from a single piece of the mountain's own granite, in a style that suggested craftsmanship so skilled it had crossed the border into something that felt less like art and more like revelation. The details were impossible. The individual hairs of its coat rendered in stone with a fidelity that made you feel, if you looked long enough, that the fur was actually moving, that the chest was actually rising and falling, that the eyes, deep set and extraordinarily expressive for carved stone, were actually tracking something just beyond your field of vision. Mara's father had done what everyone did. He had stood, said the traditional words, and turned to go. Mara had not moved. She could not have explained it then, and honestly, she never found a fully satisfying explanation in all the years that followed. There was something about the wolf's face, something about the way it looked not like a statue of something that had never lived, but like a sculpture of something that was currently living but had been stopped, mid-breath, mid-thought, mid-sentence. She looked at that face and she felt, with a child's absolute and uncomplicated certainty, that there was someone home, that whatever was behind those carved eyes was not nothing, that if she spoke, something would hear her. So she spoke. Her father called to her from the path, and she held up one finger without looking away from the wolf, a gesture so automatic and assured that it surprised even her, and she said, quietly but clearly, into the cold air that hung between her small face and that massive stone one, that she was Mara, and that she did not know what the wolf was, but that she was not afraid of it, and that she thought it looked lonely, and that she was sorry if it was lonely, because she knew what that felt like even though she was only 7, and that she hoped the winter would be kind to it too. Then she turned and walked back to her father, who was looking at her with an expression she would not understand until she was much older, something between pride and the specific kind of grief that parents feel when they see their child's essential nature clearly for the first time and realize that the world is going to have complicated feelings about it. She went back the following winter, alone this time, because she was 8 and her designation had manifested and the pilgrimage had suddenly taken on a different emotional weight. She went back and she sat in the snow in front of the great stone wolf, and she talked for a long time about what it felt like to be an Omega, and whether it was going to get harder, and whether there was something wrong with wanting things that everyone kept telling her she was not supposed to want, like the ability to make her own decisions, and the right to be taken seriously, and a future that she had chosen rather than been assigned. The wolf said nothing, but the air around it seemed, she thought, a little warmer than it should have been. She went back every winter after that, and now, let us talk about what she did not know, because this story has 2 sides, and you deserve to understand both of them. And the second side is the one that will break your heart before it puts it back together stronger than it was before. Calum. Even the name had weight to it, the kind of name that sounded like it was carved, rather than spoken, like it belonged to something older and more permanent than ordinary language. He had been, in the time before the stone, the Alpha King of the Eternal Peaks, ruler of a territory that stretched from the northern glaciers to the southern forests, sovereign over 7 major pack settlements and dozens of smaller ones, the most powerful werewolf of his generation, by any metric that power was traditionally measured in. He had also, in the quiet and complicated privacy of his own heart, been deeply uncertain about whether power as it was traditionally measured was actually the kind of power worth having. This uncertainty had not come from weakness. It had come, actually, from an excess of the thing that made him a great ruler when he allowed it to operate fully, which was his capacity to see people, not their designations, not their social positions, not the roles that had been assigned to them by a system that predated every living member of it. He saw the actual people, the consciousness and the longing and the capability that existed inside each designation-assigned identity. And what he saw did not match what the system told him he was supposed to see. He had spent years making quiet changes, small reforms that he could justify in terms the old council would accept, framing Omega rights expansions as efficiency improvements, framing beta representation as administrative optimization, moving the pieces of a more equitable society into position so carefully and so gradually that the people who would have opposed a sudden revolution did not notice they were living through a slow one. He was patient. He was strategic. He was, in the way of people who understand that lasting change requires infrastructure rather than inspiration. Quietly extraordinary. The fated Kara had a different word for it. Dangerous. Her name was Ashenvail, and she was old in the way that certain kinds of power make a person old, not in years necessarily, but in the quality of her presence, the sense that she had been watching things for so long that she had developed opinions about them that went beyond simple preference into something closer to ideology. She had built her influence over generations of the eternal peaks, whispering in the ears of alpha rulers, nudging policy in directions that benefited the old hierarchies, the clean designations, and the clear chains of authority that kept the world predictable, and therefore, in her estimation, stable. She did not think of herself as evil. She thought of herself as a conservationist, someone protecting a natural order against the erosion of well-meaning but ultimately catastrophic sentimentality. Calem's quiet revolution was, in her assessment, catastrophic sentimentality at its most dangerous. The curse she placed on him was elegant in its cruelty, which was her signature. She did not kill him. Killing him would have created a martyr, and martyrs are inconvenient because they inspire people. She froze him, not in time exactly, but in form, turning his body to stone during the coldest months, the months when his reforms were most vulnerable anyway, when council meetings slowed, and the ordinary momentum of governance stuttered against the winter's indifference. During the cold months, he would be stone. During the warm months, his body would return, but his authority would be questioned. His absence during the winter slowly eroding the confidence of his allies and the progress of his work. The council filling the vacuum with older instincts, the reforms quietly unwinding thread by thread, while he stood helpless on the ridge and could do nothing but watch. But Ashenvail had made one miscalculation, as intelligent people sometimes do when they are so certain of their own model of reality that they forget reality has opinions too. She had assumed that if Calem was removed from the game would simply continue without him. She had not accounted for the possibility that someone else would come to the stone, that someone would speak to him so honestly and so consistently over so many years that the consciousness she had locked inside the granite would not atrophy from loneliness, but would instead grow, fed by those words, maintained by that presence, kept alive and increasingly awake by the sound of one voice that never gave up on him, even though it did not know it was keeping him alive. She had not accounted for Mara. Let us go back to Mara now, because she deserves our full attention, and because what she was doing during those 20 years of conversations with a stone wolf was far more significant than she understood. She was 28, the first time she noticed that the air around the wolf seemed to respond to her. She had been talking about a particularly unjust council ruling that had stripped an Omega family of their home because the male head of household had died and left no alpha son to claim the property. And she was not just sad about it. She was furious. The kind of clean, bright fury that has justice at its core rather than ego. And she had pressed her palms flat against the wolf's chest as she spoke, needing the contact with something solid, while everything she was feeling moved through her. And the stone had been warm. Not sun-warmed, which she could have explained. Warm in the way that living things are warm, from the inside out. A heat that had no source in the physical world she could account for. She had pulled her hands back, and looked at her palms, and then looked at the wolf's face and said, very quietly, "Are you in there?" Nothing. The wind. The snow settling onto stone. She put her hands back and kept talking. She was 31 when she first heard the sound. It was less a voice than a vibration, a resonance that passed through the stone into her palms and up her arms and into the center of her chest where it sat for a moment before dissolving. It could have been the wind. It was not the wind. She knew it was. Not the wind with the same certainty she had known at 7 that there was someone home behind those eyes. She pressed closer and said, "I heard that. You don't have to say anything. But I heard that. And I want you to know." The resonance came again. Different this time. Less desperate and more deliberate. As if whatever was producing it had heard her response and was trying to refine its communication into something more coherent. She sat in the snow until her legs went completely numb that day, talking and listening and talking and listening, two beings separated by a material that should have made communication impossible, and yet somehow finding a frequency on which they could reach each other, however imperfectly, however incompletely. She was 33 when she started to understand that the wolf was responding to specific things she said, and not others, that certain topics produced stronger resonances, that questions received different vibrations than statements, that when she expressed grief, the warmth in the stone intensified as if something inside was trying to offer comfort, and when she expressed anger, the surface beneath her palm seemed almost to tremble, with something she could only describe as solidarity. She began to understand, slowly, and without the framework to fully articulate it, that she was in a conversation. She did not tell anyone. Who would she tell? That she was an Omega who spent every winter talking to a legendary stone wolf, and that the stone wolf was talking back. She could already hear how that would land in Ashenvail, could already see the expressions cycling between concern and condescension, and the particular brand of social management that the village applied to Omegas who showed signs of what the Alpha Council called emotional instability. She kept it. She held it the way she held everything that mattered to her most, close and private and protected by the simple decision not to offer it to people who would not be careful with it. She was 37 the winter everything changed. She came up the mountain as she always did, on the first true day of snowfall, the day when the temperature dropped past the threshold that turned precipitation from rain to something with weight and permanence. She had come up later than usual this year because the village had been difficult. A new Alpha Council member had introduced a proposal to formalize the property restrictions on Omegas into written law, rather than leaving them as customary practice. And the vote had been close, closer than any previous such vote had ever been, which should have been encouraging but had mostly been exhausting in the specific way that incremental progress is exhausting, when you can see so clearly how far there still is to go. She was tired. She was more tired than she had been in years. Not defeated, because Mara Ashenvail was constitutionally incapable of something as passive as defeat, but worn in the way that long campaigns wear their soldiers, the weariness of sustained effort against sustained resistance, the fatigue of caring deeply about things in a world that often rewards caring as a weakness. She climbed the mountain path, and the snow was falling properly now, thick and soft and indifferent to human concerns. And she reached the ridge and came around the final bend and saw the wolf. And stopped, because the wolf was different. She could not have said how exactly. Not at first. The stone was the same stone. The position was the same seated position with the massive head slightly lowered, as if in contemplation, and the tail curled around the enormous haunches, and the paws planted firmly on the granite base that had been its foundation since before anyone in Ashenvail was born. But something was different. The air around it had a quality she had felt before, only in the moments of strongest resonance, that sense of presence and warmth and imminent communication, but amplified now to a degree that made the previous versions of it feel like sketches compared to the finished work. She walked forward slowly, and the snow fell around her, and she lifted her hand toward the wolf's face, and she said, as she always said, "It's me. I'm back." And the stone moved, not all at once, not dramatically, not with the cinematic violence of something breaking free. It moved the way ice moves at the beginning of a thaw, in suggestion before fact, in possibility before certainty, a shift in the surface tension of the stone, a change in the light that touched it, a sound so low it was felt rather than heard, a vibration that started at the wolf's chest and moved outward through the freezing air like a pulse, like a heartbeat that had been waiting for permission to announce itself. Mara did not step back. She stepped forward. She put both hands on the wolf's muzzle, the most direct contact she had ever initiated, forehead to stone, eyes closed, and she said, clearly and without any of the qualifications she had spent 30 years learning to add to everything she said in order to make it acceptable to the world around her. "Whatever you are, whatever is happening, I am not afraid and I am not leaving. Take the time you need. I will be right here." The stone cracked. Not broke, not shattered, cracked, the way an eggshell cracks when what is inside it has finally grown large enough to need more space than its container can provide. A single fracture line ran from the base of the wolf's massive neck up through the chest, and the stone on either side of it pulsed, glowed briefly with a light that was the color of amber and heat and old gold. And then with a sound that Mara felt in every bone in her body, the stone fell away. Not all of it. The base remained, and some of the outer layers, but the core of what had been stone was stone no longer, and what stood before Mara in the swirling snow on the ridge above Ashenvail was not a statue. He was enormous, even in his own form rather than the exaggerated proportions of the stone. Calum was larger than any wolf she had ever seen, the kind of size that spoke of old bloodlines and concentrated power, the bulk of him present not as threat, but as simple physical fact. His coat was the color of iron and winter sky, gray shot through with silver and darker charcoal, and his eyes, when he raised his head from where it had rested against her hands, were gold, not amber, not honey, not any of the warmer approximations. Gold, pure and direct, and full of something that was not simply waking up, but was, unmistakably and overwhelmingly, recognition. He looked at her. She looked at him. The snow fell around them both, and the wind had gone quiet, the way wind goes quiet in the exact center of something important. He shifted. It was not a smooth transformation. 20 years of stone had made certain things rusty, had introduced inefficiencies into the process that would take time to work out. And what happened was less the elegant shift of a practiced werewolf, and more the effortful, determined, slightly ungainly emergence of someone who has been imprisoned for a very long time and is willing to endure the discomfort of freedom because the alternative is no longer acceptable. He was on his knees in the snow before Mara, in his human form now, which turned out to be a man of perhaps 40 in appearance, though she would learn later that he was something closer to 240 in actual. Years, broad through the shoulders and scarred across the chest and hands in the way of someone who had fought seriously and often, with silver-gray hair that fell to his jaw and a face that was, she thought with the part of her brain that was still managing ordinary observations, extraordinary, not beautiful in any simple way, compelling in the way that things which have survived enormous difficulty are compelling, shaped by it rather than despite it. He was shaking. His hands, pressed flat against the snow, were shaking with the effort of holding himself upright, and she understood that 20 years of stone takes something out of you physically, even when your consciousness has been maintained, that he was going to need time and warmth and probably food and definitely rest before he was anything like stable. She knelt in the snow in front of him. She was aware that this was almost certainly an alpha king, or something equivalent to one, aware that the protocol she had grown up with would demand a specific set of behaviors from an omega in this situation, a respectful distance and a lowered gaze and a careful deference to whatever he chose to do next. She was also aware, with the clarity of someone who had spent 20 winters giving her most honest self to something without any expectation of return, that she was not going to perform for this person, that she was going to be, as she always had been with him, exactly herself. She cupped his face in her hands, his stubbled, jaw cold from 20 years of winter, and she said, "Hello, I think I've been talking to you for a long time." He made a sound that was not quite a word, and not quite a sob, and was entirely a form of recognition, and he leaned his forehead against hers, and for a long moment, that was all that happened. The two of them kneeling in the falling snow on the ridge above the village, foreheads together, the bond between them so old and so established by that point that it did not need to introduce itself. It simply was, recognized on both sides simultaneously, like a word you already know the meaning of encountering its definition for the first time, and feeling the satisfaction of confirmation rather than the disorientation of new information. "You came every year," he said. His voice was rough with disuse, every consonant an effort. But it was there. It was real. And she felt it in her chest in the way she had felt the resonances through stone, but fuller now, richer, the difference between a signal and the thing that was sending it. "Every year," she confirmed. "I heard everything." She considered this. The implications of it were significant. Everything she had said over 20 winters now known to someone who turned out to be a real and present person, rather than a sympathetic stone surface. But when she examined her feelings about it, she found something she had not expected to find, which was relief. Complete and uncomplicated relief. Because she had never said anything, to that stone wolf, that she would not have said to his face if she had known he was there. She had only ever brought the truth up that mountain. "Good," she said. He looked at her. She looked back. "You were angry about the property restrictions," he said. "I'm still angry about the property restrictions. You're right to be. They're unjust. I know. I was trying to dismantle them. Before." He closed his eyes briefly, the weight of 20 lost years visible in the gesture. "The council will have undone most of what I built. Not all of it," she said. She did not know why she said it, except that it was true. That she had watched the village politics carefully for 20 years, and certain things had held. Certain small dignities had become normalized enough that removing them felt, even to those who would have preferred to, like it cost too much socially. Some of it held. He opened his eyes. That gold gaze, impossible and direct. "You," she shook her head. "Not just me. Others. People who understood that things were better and didn't want to go back. You planted seeds. They kept growing." He was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. And she watched his face do something complicated and private. The face of someone being told that their work was not entirely erased, that the years were not entirely lost. And she understood that this information was something he was going to need to hold on to in the coming days, when the full accounting of what the curse had cost him became clear. "We need to get you off this mountain," she said, shifting to the practical, because the practical was what was immediately necessary. "You need warmth and food, and probably a considerable amount of time before you face anything more complicated than basic survival. There will be people who need to know I have returned. There will also be people who would prefer you hadn't, and you are currently unable to stand, which limits your options considerably." She stood and held out her hand. He looked at it for a moment. This Omega woman who had spoken her truth to a stone for 20 winters and asked nothing in return, and was now offering to help him stand as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. And something in his expression shifted into something she would have called reverence if the word had not seemed so enormous, so outside the usual range of what people offered to someone of her designation. He took her hand. Standing was an event. It involved more effort and coordination than either of them had anticipated, and what resulted was less a graceful rise and more a collaborative project with Mara providing counterweight and Calum providing determination, and both of them making small adjustments until he was approximately upright and had found a way to distribute his weight that did not immediately collapse. He was, standing, truly enormous. She came to approximately his mid-chest. He was also cold in the way stone is cold, retaining the temperature of his centuries on the ridge, and she made an executive decision and pulled his arm around her shoulders to share body heat while they navigated the mountain path, which was either the most natural thing in the world or a significant designation protocol violation depending on who you asked, and she had stopped asking those particular people some years ago. They came down the mountain as night was beginning to settle over Ashenvail, the lights of the village coming on one by one in the early dark of the winter evening, and Mara did not take him into the village. She took him to the small house on the outskirts that had been her family's, and then been hers alone for the past 6 years, since her parents had passed within months of each other in the way of mated pairs who could not quite manage to remain in the world without the other. It was not a large house, but it was solid and well insulated, and she kept it warm because she ran cold, a characteristic of Omega designation that she had always privately thought was the universe's way of ensuring Omegas never got too comfortable with solitude. She sat him in front of the fire, and she made food, the simple, substantial food of someone who understands that a body recovering from extraordinary circumstances needs calories and warmth more than it needs elegance. And she brought it to him, and he ate with the focused single-mindedness of someone who has not eaten in 20 years, which was, she reflected, literally true. While he ate, she watched him and tried to organize what she was feeling into something she could work with. The bond was already established. She could feel it operating at full capacity despite the fact that they had met in person approximately 2 hours ago. The mate bond that the werewolf world recognized as the most fundamental and incontrovertible of its structural elements. The pairing of two souls that was supposed to be destiny and was, in her experience of the concept, frequently used as a justification for things that actually had much more to do with power and social convenience than with anything so honest as fate. But this felt different. This felt like what the bond was supposed to be, when it was not being filtered through a hierarchy that had decided in advance what it should look like. This felt like the 20 years of genuine knowing that it actually was, expressed through a channel that was simply wider now, more complete, more possible. "You need to tell me," she said. When the food was gone and he had some color back in his face. "Who cursed you, and why?" He told her. He told her about Ashenvail, and the reforms, and the council, and the strategy, and the slow revolution he had been building, and the mistake he had made in underestimating the Fae Desira's willingness to intervene directly. He told her about the experience of being stone, which was not nothing as she might have imagined, but was also not exactly something in any comfortable sense, a trapped awareness, that could perceive, but not act, that could feel, but not express, that received the world in fragments, and could do nothing with what it received, except hold it. He told her about the first time he heard her voice, a child's voice, clear and unafraid and honest in a way that had cut through the gray numbness of the stone like something bright and particular, a signal in static. "I did not know what you were at first," he said. "I knew you were real. I knew your presence was different from anything I had experienced in the stone. But I did not understand for a very long time that it was your voice that was keeping me coherent. That without you, each winter, I would have..." He paused. "I would have become the stone. Not just been inside it. Become it." Mara was quiet for a moment. "She wanted you to disappear." Yes. She did not expect anyone to care about a statue enough to keep talking to it. "She did not account for you." "No one ever does," Mara said, and there was no bitterness in it. Simply fact. The observation of someone who had spent a lifetime being underestimated and had made a strategy of it. "It's one of my most useful qualities." He looked at her, that gold gaze steady and full of something she was going to need time to learn to receive, without flinching. Not because it frightened her, but because it was so completely different from how she had been looked at for most of her life, that her nervous system was still calibrating. He was looking at her, like she was important. Not important for what she could provide, or important relative to her designation, or important with qualifications and asterisks. Just important. Completely. And without reservation. "You could have stopped coming," he said. "Any year. You had no reason to believe anything would come of it." "I had every reason to keep coming," she said. "Talking to you was the one place I never had to perform. Never had to translate myself into something more acceptable. You could not respond in a way that would punish me for what I said. So I said everything. It was the only truly free conversation I had. For 20 years. She paused. "And I thought you were lonely. I could not abandon someone who was lonely." He was silent for a long time. The fire crackled between them, and the snow continued outside, and Ashenvail went about its evening not yet knowing what had come down from the ridge, and was sitting in front of an Omega woman's fire in a small house on the outskirts of everything they thought they knew. "What do you want?" he asked. "Not what do Omegas want. Not what would be appropriate for someone of her designation. Not what does the mate bond dictate. What do you want?" The question in its simplest and most direct form asked of her specifically her individual wants, as if those were the relevant variable. She considered it honestly, because that was the only way she knew how to consider things when it came to him. "I want the property restrictions removed. From the law rather than just from practice," she said. "I want Omegas on the council. Not one, as a gesture, but enough to constitute a genuine voice. I want the paired consent laws reformed, so that no Omega can be matched without their explicit verbal agreement witnessed by a third party of their choosing. I want the designation-based education tracking eliminated so that Omega children are taught the same curriculum as Alpha and Beta children from the start. She paused, and I want to finish. The conversation we started 20 years ago, properly, with you actually present. Something happened in his face that she did not have a word for yet. She was going to need a new vocabulary for some of what he expressed. She could already tell, because it was outside the range of what the people in her life had generally offered her. I can do all of those things, he said. The first 4 will take time and strategy, and I will need to rebuild my council standing, and there will be resistance, and some of it will be fierce, but I know how to do it. I have been thinking about how to do it for 20 years. A pause. The 5th one I would like to start immediately, if you are willing. She smiled. It was not a performance of a smile, not the managed expression she had learned to produce for social situations, but the real thing, which was slightly asymmetrical and reached her eyes and made her look about 15 years younger, or possibly just like herself without the weight of 37 years of navigation resting on top of it. I've been waiting 20 winters, she said. I'm not going anywhere. And here I want to pause for just a moment, because if you have felt anything in this story so far, I want you to drop it in the comments, because you are not alone in feeling it. And there is something beautiful about knowing that when a story moves, it is moving other people at the same time, across distances that should make connection impossible, and don't. And if you are not yet subscribed to this channel, this is your moment, because we have so much more of this to give you. The weeks that followed Calum's return were not simple. Nothing about the situation was built for simplicity, and Mara would not have respected a version of it that was. Calum's physical recovery took longer than he had expected, and she would not have admitted this to him because she understood his relationship with his own capability. But she had expected. The body that had been stone for 20 winters needed to relearn certain things that most bodies learn once and never have to revisit. The regulation of temperature, the management of hunger and fatigue, the million small calibrations that an aware and mobile physical existence requires moment to moment. He was not weak. He was recalibrating, which was different. And she treated it as different, providing what was needed without commentary, and giving him space to manage the experience in the way he needed to manage it. What she had not fully prepared for was living in close proximity to someone she had known entirely through stone and voice and resonance, someone she now had to navigate as a physical and present person with habits and preferences and a way of moving through a room that was, she was somewhat irritated to discover, extremely difficult not to watch. He moved like someone who had once taken up exactly the right amount of space and was in the process of remembering what that felt like. He moved, like consequence. She was a pragmatic person, and she did not have the patience for her own distraction, so she noted it, filed it appropriately, and redirected herself to the work. The work was considerable. Calum's first act upon recovering sufficient stability to function in public was to request an audience with the Ashenvail Council, which consisted of 7 members, 5 Alpha and 2 Beta, and which had in Calum's 20-year absence collectively convinced itself that the absence was permanent, and the arrangement that had evolved to fill the vacuum was legitimate. They received him with a range of responses that ran from genuine relief through political calculation to something she would have called fear if the council members had been people she had more sympathy for. His authority was not technically in question. The Eternal Peaks recognized no term limits on its sovereign position, and the absence of a confirmed death meant the throne had remained his in legal theory even, as it emptied in practical fact. But legal theory and practical fact are different animals, and the council spent the first meeting mostly taking the measure of this returned king and deciding how much of what they had built in his absence they were willing to offer back. Mara sat in the back of the room during this first meeting. Omegas did not typically attend council meetings at all, and she had expected Calum to make no mention of her presence in the session, understanding that introducing her into the political equation before his position was stabilized would create complications that could undermine both the meeting's outcome and her own longer-term effectiveness. She had underestimated him. "I will also note," he said, in the middle of a discussion about transitional governance arrangements, his voice entirely even, as if what he was about to say were as standard and unremarkable as any other administrative matter. That I am taking direct counsel from Mara Ashenvail, who many of you will know as a resident of the Southern District and an Omega, and an individual whose understanding of the social conditions in this territory over the past 2 decades significantly exceeds my own. I will be asking her to join the council within the next 2 sessions on a formal consultative basis pending the fuller governance reforms we will be discussing going forward. The silence in the room had a texture. She felt each component of it separately. The shock, the calculation, the offense, the quick readjustment of assumptions, and, from the 2 beta members who were sitting slightly apart from the alphas, something that was not quite hope, but was the careful ancestor of it, the watchful attention of people who have been told for a very long time that things are a certain way and are now observing evidence that things might be different. She said nothing. She did not need to. Calum had said it clearly enough, and she was aware that the most powerful thing she could do in this particular moment was to be unremarkable, to already be present as if she had always been there, which was, she was beginning to understand, one of the primary strategies of change. Not the dramatic arrival, but the quiet establishment, the normalization that happens when something new stops being new, because it is consistently there. She became consistently there. Over the weeks following the first council meeting, she appeared at subsequent ones, initially in the consultative capacity Calum had described, and then in a fuller role as the council's composition began to shift, as members who had grown comfortable with the absence of an actual sovereign found that comfort eroding under the sustained pressure of a king who had spent 20 years thinking, and was now thinking out loud with full authority behind his conclusions. She was not the only Omega voice eventually. She worked to ensure that, recruiting others, identifying the Omegas in Ashenvail whose capabilities were obvious and whose voices had been systematically excluded, building the foundation of something that could outlast any individual, including herself. Calum watched this, and did not interfere, and did not manage it, and did not offer guidance unless asked, which he understood was the correct response even when it required an act of will. Because he had seen in 20 years of consciousness within stone what happened when capable people were managed rather than supported, the subtle diminishment of it, the erosion of confidence and initiative that came from never being fully trusted with your own competence. He trusted her completely. He had been listening to evidence of her trustworthiness for 20 years. What was growing between them was not uncomplicated. She would have been suspicious of uncomplicated. In this as in everything, the mate bond was present and real, and she felt it as a kind of warmth in the chest that was available constantly and that intensified when he was near. But she was also still herself, still the woman who had spent 37 years developing an interior life that was entirely her own, who had made a self out of the limited materials available to her in Ashenvail's Omega designation, and she was not prepared to subsume that self into the mate bond as if it were the ultimate destination rather than simply the beginning of something. She told him this directly one evening when they had been working late on a proposal for the educational reform, and he had looked at her across the table with that gold gaze that still needed its own vocabulary, and she had felt the pull of it strongly enough that she thought they needed to be clear about some things. "I am not going to become your queen and stop being myself," she said. "I will not manage your schedule and keep your household and make decisions about what to wear to formal occasions. I will be a partner in everything that partnership means, including the political work and the governance and the ongoing project of making this territory something worth ruling. But I am not a consort. I am not an accessory. I am a full participant, or I am something else entirely, and I need to know that you understand that before this goes further." He had listened to the entire thing without interrupting, which she noted and appreciated. Then he said, "I know. I have been listening to you explain exactly who you are for 20 years. I did not fall in love with someone who would subsume herself. I fell in love with the person who refused to." She looked at him for a long time. The fire was low by then, and the work on the table between them was extensive and complicated, and genuinely important. And she thought, with the part of herself that could observe even insignificant moments, that this was what she wanted. Not the dramatic declaration in a vacuum, but the declaration in the middle of the work. The love that existed alongside the purpose rather than replacing it. The partnership that included both the personal and the political. Because in a life built the way hers was built, they had never been separate things. Good, she said. And then, because she had been honest with him for 20 years and was not going to stop now, I love you too, in case that needed saying. It did not need saying, he said. I heard it every winter. I have heard it in every single thing you have done since I came down from that mountain. But I am glad you said it anyway. Now I have to tell you. About Ashenvail. Because no story with a curse in it gets to resolve without addressing the source of the curse. And the resolution here is perhaps not what you are expecting, and I think that is part of why it matters. Ashenvail came to Ashenvail 17 months after Calem's return, which was not immediately and not dramatically, but was, in its way, inevitable. She came not in hiding but in presentation, arrived at the council building on a gray winter morning, and requested an audience, and was granted one, because Calem had learned very early in his return that refusing to see difficult things did not make them less present. It simply removed your ability to have any input into what they did. She was older than Mara had imagined, which was saying something given that she had imagined someone ancient. There was in her presence the quality of exhaustion that comes not from age alone, but from the specific fatigue of someone who has maintained a position for so long that they have forgotten it was a choice rather than a fact, who has confused their preferences for the natural order so completely that the challenge to their preferences feels like a violation of reality rather than simply a disagreement. You have undone everything I protected, she said to Calem. She was not performing. That was the thing that surprised Mara most, watching this from her seat at the council table. Ashenvail was not a villain issuing a monologue. She was a person who genuinely believed she was right, expressing genuine grief about changes she genuinely mourned. You protected a hierarchy, Calem said. The hierarchy was not the same thing as the people in it. Without structure, they are chaos. Without equity, they are a slow collapse, Mara said. She had not planned to speak, but the words were simply there, necessary. A system that requires the suppression of half its members to function is not stable. It is pressurized. The longer it holds, the worse the eventual release. Ashenvail looked at her with the assessment of someone seeing a variable they had fundamentally miscalculated. You. Me. I did not account for you. I know, Mara said. Most people don't. What happened in that room over the next 4 hours was not a dramatic confrontation. It was a negotiation, and a difficult one. And by the end of it, Ashenvail had agreed to remove the residual elements of the curse, which had been maintaining certain compulsions in the council members who had benefited from Calem's absence, maintaining them subtly and without the affected party's knowledge, which was a significant harm that needed addressing regardless of everything else. In exchange, Calem agreed to nothing except to listen to her concerns through a formal diplomatic channel, which was not an agreement to change anything, but was an agreement to hear, which was apparently more than she had expected and more than she had received in a very long time. She was not reformed. People who have held a position for centuries do not shift that position in an afternoon. But she left without re-establishing the curse, and she left without making new threats. And she left, Mara thought, with something slightly different on her face than what she had arrived with. Some minute recalibration of her assumptions. The beginning of a reassessment that might or might not lead anywhere significant. It was not a happy ending for Ashenvail, but it was a real one. The educational reforms passed in the 2nd year. The property laws changed in the 3rd. The consent requirements for paired matching were restructured before the end of the 1st year, moving quickly because the cases that had accumulated during Calem's absence were documented and specific, and the harm they represented was not theoretical. And Mara had been documenting them for years, with exactly this kind of moment in mind, a habit of preparation for a future she had not known would take the shape it did, but had believed, with a faith built out of consistent practice rather than easy hope, would eventually arrive. The council changed more slowly, as councils do, as the composition shifted through retirements and elections, and the gradual retirement of old assumptions that comes when new assumptions are consistently modeled by people in positions of authority. It did not become a perfect council. There is no such thing, but it became a council that contained more of Ashenvail's actual population, that made decisions. With more of Ashenvail's actual experiences represented in the room, that was slower to reach consensus, partly because consensus now required the agreement of more varied voices, and that was, Mara thought, not a flaw in the new system, but its greatest feature. The friction of genuine representation, the productive difficulty of actually governing for everyone. She became, in the years that followed, many things. A council member, and then a senior council member, and then the position that Calum created specifically because she had made it necessary, the Chancellor of Social Equity, which was a title that some members of the territory's traditional hierarchy found simultaneously alarming and impossible to object to, without making explicit the biases they preferred to keep implicit. She was also his partner in the full sense she had specified that evening over the table, the person whose counsel he sought, and whose challenge he accepted, and whose presence in his life was not a comfort. That softened his work, but an abrasion that sharpened it, because she was constitutionally incapable of telling him something was good enough when she believed it could be better. She was also, in the private and non-political portions of their life together, the person he talked to about the 20 years in the stone in the way he could not talk to anyone else, because only she had been there for all of it. Only she understood both the isolation and the strange sustenance of those winter conversations. Only she knew what he was referring to when he said that the worst part had not been the stillness, but the moments when he heard something that demanded response and had no voice to respond with. She listened to this without trying to fix it, because it was not fixable. Because 20 years in stone is 20 years in stone, and no amount of subsequent freedom eliminates the fact of it, only adds to it, adds context and continuation, and eventually the weight of a life lived after, rather than within. She listened, and she held his hands, and sometimes she pressed her forehead to his, as she had on that first day in the snow, and said nothing at all, which was its own kind of answer. Before I tell you the epilogue, I want to ask you something. In the comments, I want to know, what is the longest you have ever believed in something that could not give you evidence in return? What is the thing you kept faith with even when the faith was unrewarded, and did it ever pay off? And if it didn't, do you think the keeping of it still mattered? Because I think this story is about that. I think it is about what you become through sustained belief, what you build in yourself by choosing to keep showing up to something that cannot thank you for it. Leave your answer below, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please do, because these conversations matter, and so do you. Now, the epilogue. 5 years after Calum came down from the mountain, on the first day of true snowfall in what had become a very different Ashenvail than the one Mara had grown up in, they went up the mountain together. It was not the formal pilgrimage of Mara's childhood. There was no village procession, no performance of tradition for the watching eyes of the community. They went early, before the village had properly woken, the two of them on the path in the snow, with their breath visible in the cold air and the mountain quiet around them, and the sky the particular shade of white-gray that meant more. Snow was coming and would arrive before they came back down. She had not been back since the day he returned. She had noticed this about herself without examining it too closely, understanding that she would know when it was time. The ridge had been his prison, the place where he had been held, and she had not been sure whether her presence there would help or hinder whatever processing that required. And she had been patient with the not knowing the way she was patient with most things that needed time rather than action. But on this morning, on the first snow of the 5th year, she had known it was time. She had told him so over breakfast, and he had said nothing, simply stood and put on his coat, and they had gone. The stone base was still there on the ridge. The outer stone that had fallen away when he emerged had been left where it landed, partially buried now by seasons of snowfall. But the base, the enormous granite foundation on which he had rested for 20 years, was still in place, And it looked, now that it was empty, different than she had expected. Less like a prison, and more like a throne. Less like a trap, and more like a place where something had been held safe until it was ready. She stood in front of it and looked at the empty space where the great stone wolf had been. And she felt a complicated layering of things. Grief for the 20 years. Gratitude for what those years had given her. The habit of honesty. The practice of speaking without expectation of reward. The woman she had become by showing up consistently to something that could not thank her for showing up. The relief that was still present 5 years later, of having an answer to the question she had not consciously known she was asking every time she climbed that mountain. Calum stood beside her. He had been quiet on the walk up, and he was quiet now, and she understood that this place had its own complicated weight for him, that what it cost him to return here was different in kind, and probably degree from what it cost her, and she did not try to manage his experience of it. She simply stood with him in it. After a long time, he said, "You kept me alive. You kept yourself alive," she said. "I just gave you something to listen to. Mara, don't diminish what you did. It was 20 years of holding your own mind together inside stone. I just talked. You just talked," he said. And there was something in his voice that she still did not have the vocabulary for, but was learning, the particular quality of feeling that exceeds what ordinary language can hold, that exists in the excess of it, in what gets communicated around and through the words rather than by them. For 20 years. To something that couldn't answer, because you thought it might be lonely. It was lonely, she said. Yes, he said. It was. She took his hand. The snow was beginning, the next wave of it arriving as predicted, soft and indifferent and ongoing, and the mountain was quiet around. Them in the village below was waking. Somewhere down there, a more just version of the world they had both been born into was continuing its imperfect and ongoing effort to be what it was supposed to be, and she felt, standing in the snow with his hand in hers, and the empty stone base of his former prison in front of them, and the whole complicated, beautiful, difficult future laid out in every direction, something she had felt before only in glimpses, something she had talked about to a stone wolf, in the hope that one day it might be real. Content, not happy in the simple way that simple stories end, not resolved in the way that suggests nothing will be hard again. Content in the way of someone who has done the work and is continuing to do the work, and knows that the work is the point, that the doing of it in partnership with someone who understands it as deeply as you do is the closest thing to a destination that an honest life can offer. She leaned into him slightly. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders. The snow fell. The mountain held them both, as it had always held them, separately and then together, with the impartiality of old stone that has seen everything and judged nothing, and simply endured. And endurance, she had come to believe, was its own kind of grace. Thank you for spending this time with us today. If this story reached something in you, please share it with someone who needs it, someone who is in the middle of believing in something that hasn't answered. Yet, someone who keeps showing up to things that can't thank them for showing up, because this story is for them. It is specifically and entirely for them. Leave a comment telling us what you felt. Leave a like if this story was worth your time, and subscribe if you want to be here when the next one arrives. We will see you then. Take care of yourselves until we do.